the cardinal sin in geopolitics is mirroring your adversary or your competitor. And we have a tendency to do that by saying, oh, well, the Chinese wouldn't do action A because it would be bad for the economy. Well, that is an indication, a gross misconceptual understanding of how the Chinese Communist Party functions. So we can't mirror our own values or our own way or our own standards onto their concepts and how they would fight. We need to fight our own war, and it has to be informed by the vulnerabilities of their thinking, but also where they're making their investments in the military. Right now, they're just using brute force, which worked great for us in World War II. Hopefully, it won't work for the Chinese if they decide to pull the trigger. But we have to be smart, and we have to be stronger.
Hello, everyone. This is Admiral James Foggo from the Center for Maritime Strategy at the Navy League of the United States, just outside Washington, D.C. You're listening to Maritime Nation, the Center for Maritime Strategy's podcast designed to dive deeply into the policy challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States as a sea power on the global stage. Thank you to Dataminr for sponsoring Season 4 of Maritime Nation. We're honored today to be joined by Brent Sadler. Brent, thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, Admiral.
Brent Sadler is a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Allison Center for National Security and the author of the new book, Naval Power in Action, Seizing the Initiative in the New Cold War with China. Brent joined the Heritage Foundation after a 26-year career in the Navy. During this time, he completed multiple operational tours on nuclear submarines, worked on the Chief of Naval Operations staff, and served as a military diplomat in Asia. As a senior research fellow, Brent's focus is on maritime security and the technologies shaping our future maritime forces, especially the United States Navy. Brent is a 1994 graduate of the United States Naval Academy. Go Navy and beat Army. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Systems Engineering and a minor in Japanese. He holds advanced degrees from the National War College and Joshi University, where he studied as an Olmsted Scholar in 2004, something near and dear to my heart. He's a Naval Academy graduate, he's a submariner, and like me, he's an Olmsted Scholar as well. And that is a wonderful program for any of you listeners out there that are thinking about it. Lieutenants, lieutenant commanders, sign up. And if you want to talk to me, I'm the chairman of the board of the Olmsted Foundation. I'd be happy to give you some pointers. So Brent, welcome to Maritime Nation, and congratulations on your book, Naval Power in Action. Now, this is the second of a trilogy of books, right?
Yes.
First one was Naval Power in the 21st Century, one that I also read. I finished this book this weekend, Naval Power in Action. And your third is going to be something like Naval Power at the deck plate level. You want to give us a hint, maybe?
Yeah.
I know you're still in the writing phase. It hasn't been published yet. But what's coming on the horizon?
Yeah, thanks for that, and thanks again for the chance to talk about, naval power, something near and dear to my heart, and especially in these very testy times that we're in right now. The third book is intended to from the viewpoint of the deck plates. So if you're a department head or commanding officer to a staffer at an American embassy somewhere overseas, someone working as a staffer in Congress, or even someone in the boardroom running a shipbuilding company or a shipper. The intent is to try to make real a lot of the big theoretical or statecrafty kind of things in the first book, and also the big nationally impactful actions that are laid out in the second book, but to put it into the context of the folks, the ladies and gentlemen that are going to be executing these types of things, and to see opportunities in the millions of decisions and reality that you have to deal with day to day in actual work. But the tensions are only going up, I think, in my assessment, which means the urgency for action is sharper than ever. And we need people that are energized. And the third book is intended to also kind of energize that action.
So a little bit about our people, our sailors, our chiefs, our officers, and how we're doing things down at deck plate. Love it. I'm looking forward to that. Like I said, I finished the second book this weekend. And in the opening pages of that book, you describe America's current approach to great power competition with China as shooting behind the duck. And we do have a tendency to do that in our joint force. So what developments or current policies are driving that conclusion for you?
Yes. Part of it's structural, which is the third part of the book is about reorganization. The other is the way that's just the nature of democracies, and also human nature. So from the human nature part, we've had 30 plus years of general peace that's starting to fray and fall apart because we've gotten used to that and without having to pay for it. And the bill is starting to come due, unfortunately. But human nature is why change if change is not required or if the system's not broken. By every indication, the system's broken. We just haven't really been faced with that reality. So that's the human nature part of why we're at it. The institutional part is we're structured to wage a Cold War that we won against the Soviet Union and no longer is needed since 1989. But the structure kind of worked through the peace dividend era in the 90s. It worked well enough with a little bit of duct tape through the 2000s and the early teens for the global war on terror. It wasn't perfect for that either. But what we're seeing now with a competitor like China that we are not pacing and who we're neither deterring, we have not been able to maintain the military capability, capacities, and readiness that's going to move the needle in Beijing's calculus. It certainly didn't deter major war in Europe in 2022. It certainly didn't keep the Iranians from launching ballistic missiles against our ally Israel. And it certainly didn't keep the Houthis from taking pot shots at shipping going through the Red Sea. So we have to change our statecraft. We have to change our structure. And we have to also be very sensitive to the human nature part of it. Again, that's why the third book.
Yeah, thanks. And, your comments resonate with me. I mean, we are less prone to take action that will guarantee deterrence, which means you got to take action early. You have to do preemptive action as opposed to waiting for something to happen and then to try to inflict punishment on an adversary or somebody who's done something wrong. And it's much easier, I think, to keep people out of territory that you don't want them in than it is to try to throw them out at a later date once they've crossed the line. So I'm with you 100%. One of the book's central themes is the concept of naval statecraft. I love that term. So Brent, what is naval statecraft? Tell our audience, and how does it differ from America's current approach to international affairs, and how would America operationalize this new approach?
Yeah, this is perhaps the center point of the first book, and it really is a book that's meant to explain what it is and how to actually implement it. I do kind of revisit this question because it's important to kind of have a general understanding. It's not just a simple, whole of governance approach. It's not an integrated deterrence approach either. It's actually much more fundamental than that. It's a blurring of the distinctions of economic statecraft, diplomacy, and military, in this case, more maritime or naval presence, where they're actually working like a soccer team to advance American interest. Sometimes the diplomat has to be aggressive and lead and supported by the other two. Other times, it's the naval presence that actually sets the conditions and drives, and the diplomat is in a supporting role. Economic statecraft is a tool that we haven't really used as effectively as we can. Some of that's changing, and I would argue that the use of tariffs right now should be viewed as the early stages of refining our use of economic statecraft. But naval statecraft, which some call maritime statecraft, and I think that might be more appropriate because it's also industrial and looking at production and trade.
Roger.
It's how you blend those all together to advance American interest, not independently, but together.
Well, I was impressed on this book because the guy that wrote your foreword for this book is somebody near and dear to our heart at the Center for Maritime Strategy. In fact, an inspiration for the Center for Maritime Strategy, and that is former Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, and author of the book, Oceans Ventured, which we also have here with us today. It's a great book. I did a review on it. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. Secretary Lehman in his foreword says that we should be studying the Chinese and that we should not overcompensate or try to mirror image what they are building and how they are constructing their fleet. I mean, they've got a lot of ships, 400 ships to our 300 ships. And he says, go after, understand their strategy and go after their weaknesses and their vulnerabilities. And I would agree with that. And so Oceans Ventured, when I first read it back in 2018, I was asked to do a review for the Naval Institute. I was struck by the the number of exercises and the aggressiveness of the United States Navy to push our carrier strike groups up over the top of the Kola Peninsula. And I can remember, Admiral Mustin talking about this when he was delivering the strategy back in '86 and going out to fleet concentration areas. Says, we're going to stick it to them. And that became a cost-imposing strategy. And so I actually used the tenets of this book in Exercise Trident Juncture in 2018. It was the largest Cold War exercise in NATO since 1987. And, 50,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, 70 big ships, including the Harry S. Truman and the EWO strike group, 10,000 tanks, rolling vehicles, and 300 aircraft. And it was in Article 5 that pushed the Russians out, again, assuming that they got into northern Norway and you had to get them out. We had to move all that stuff, live-ex, for real, into Norway in about 30 days. So we learned a lot from that. And we were talking earlier about, Admiral Franchetti. She worked for me as Sixth Fleet Commander, and her tendencies were, well, we're not going to do exercises. We're going to do rehearsals of concept. So maritime or multi-domain operations and maritime domain operations have been around for a long time. We know what we're doing, so let's not go and test some of these nitnoid little things that may or may not make a difference. Let's actually do a rehearsal of concept to either deter an enemy from coming ashore or push an enemy out of territory. And I'm all about that. Rock drills, we call it. So, what kind of inspiration did you take from Oceans Ventured, and how did that impact the writing of this book, and will it impact the next one?
Yeah, no, so Ocean Ventured, and John Lehman's been a huge mentor of mine since I was at Heritage. I was lucky enough to actually meet him and talk many times since. The experience of Ocean Ventured is all three levels. One, it informs the notion of naval statecraft. It is, at its time, a form of naval statecraft. And it wasn't just operating up inside the Soviet Union's, vulnerable northern areas or sensitive military areas where we chose not to operate for too long. It was more than that. It was also getting into the psyche and understanding the Soviet mentality at the same time. So you can't mirror. The cardinal sin in geopolitics is mirroring your adversary or your competitor. And we have a tendency to do that by saying, the Chinese wouldn't do action A because it would be bad for the economy. Well, that is an indication, a gross misconceptual understanding of how the Chinese Communist Party functions. So we can't mirror our own values or our own way or our own standards onto their concepts and how they would fight. We need to fight our own war, and it has to be informed by the vulnerabilities of their thinking, but also where they're making their investments in the military. Right now, they're just using brute force, which worked great for us in World War II. Hopefully, it won't work for the Chinese if they decide to pull the trigger. But we have to be smart, and we have to be stronger.
Well, this book, the second in the trilogy, is really divided into three parts: strengthening overseas basing, strengthening the homeland, and that being manufacturing, not necessarily our borders, but having an industrial base that will support the Navy the nation needs, and reorganizing to seize the initiative. You talk about establishing a Maritime Department, rebuilding commercial shipping, something, again, near and dear to our heart at the Center for Maritime Strategy, because we just published Returning from Ebb Tide. You're an author in that book. Thank you very much. And it's all about bringing back the commercial and military SEAL of Command and Merchant Marine, because they support our Navy, our Marines, and our sea services forward deployed. You got to be able to get the beans and the bullets and the fuel to the troops, and particularly with the tyranny of distance out in the Pacific. And finally, third tenet of the third section, an ocean-centered naval fleet aligned with combatant commanders. I thought that was really interesting because COCOMs have an insatiable appetite for Navy. And you and I are both submariners. We know the demand signal for submarines. Right now we have about 50 boats. A lot of them, 18% of them are in the yard. We need to get them out. There's just not enough to go around. So comments on the structure of the book and what drove you to that, or any particular passages or chapters that you want to focus on?
Yeah, so like the first book, there's an equation in it as a good nuke, and it uses a thing called trend analysis. But unlike the first book, which with a very long equation was used to lay out like the force sizing and design, this proposed to how to actually win this Cold War with China, and at the same time keep the other adversaries at bay. This book's equation informs the entire structure of the book, and it's about deterring China. Again, there's an urgency here, and the three terms of the equation is a military balance. This is counting like VLS cells versus adversaries VLS cells. It's the military balance, and that includes allies and partners in the equation. The second term is economic resiliency, or the ability to resist economic coercion. And the third term is effective political control, from the Chinese perspective. And so the first part of the book is about how can you change that military to military balance. Things like trying to complicate the Chinese basing efforts through their Belt and Road initiatives, how to actually operate in just strategic, decisive theaters that they cannot ignore. In other words, bring them to a place of our choosing where we can have the strategic initiative. And this concept was introduced in the first book. The two theaters that are most important now is the Eastern Mediterranean and the South China Sea. It's not an or, but the Chinese are much more sensitive to the South China Sea. They are not insensitive to the Eastern Mediterranean at the same time. The second part of the book is that second term. It's the economic resilience. So a stronger commercial American maritime industry, better operational energy resiliency. These are things that are important. And also a new fleet structure. They talk about, I'm a big unabashedly proponent of a first fleet focused on waging a counter-maritime insurgency counterinsurgency in the South China Sea. But first fleet also can help with AUKUS. And so it's how can you actually reduce that economic vulnerabilities and industrial vulnerabilities. The third section of the book is about reorganizing. And again, this is another important one that'll change the Chinese thinking about can they politically control. And it kind of gets to some earlier comments about why is it that we've been so reactive for far too long. This gets to that.
Okay, that's great. And that's a great segue into follow-up on the Chinese aggression equation. It's a term you use in the book to describe the balance between our two forces. So on page 18 of the book, you lay out the equation in a little gray shaded box, and it is Chinese aggression equals military balance plus secure economy plus effective political control. So can you explain a little bit about each of those variables and what that means? And then as far as the Chinese aggression equation, how are we doing in the United States in responding to that and blunting or deterring that aggression?
Yeah, the jury's still out on whether or not we're going to be able to move the needle in the right way to keep or to reverse the trends towards Chinese aggression in 2027. The jury's still out. And let me give you a case in point. The most recent lethal incident in the South China Sea. With the Chinese. And I'll use the equation to explain my thinking, because it really is the type of thing that I was postulating when I was 2 years ago when I was trying to put this all down to paper. It's kind of a scientific approach to trying to confirm assumptions about what the Chinese are up to. So in early August, those that may not be familiar, the Chinese were trying to intimidate and use lethal force, by all account, my estimation, to intercept Philippine maritime operation around Scarborough Shoal, contested by the Chinese. They had a Chinese Coast Guard cutter in trail, and at high speed, a lot of maneuvering, and a Chinese destroyer looked like intended to use lethal force to ram the Philippine vessel. It, in fact, instead rammed the Chinese Coast Guard vessel, and by accounts we've heard there were deaths. We don't know exactly the clarity about how many, but the Chinese basically had a red-on-red collision.
Yeah.
Okay, so why would they do this? Let's use the equation. If 2027 is what you're building for, that first term, the military balance, that's easy. That's bean counting. How many missiles, how many ships, how many aircraft, the allies that are most likely to be involved in any war, most likely the trigger is a conflict over the fate of Taiwan. That's easy. And right now, the Chinese have an advantage, a comprehensive advantage. If you just count, not a quantitative estimation, not a qualitative one, because it becomes a lot more subjective. The economic resiliency, in 2014, they created their own SWIFT system to move electronic funds between, and they've been using it to avoid sanctions with Russia.
Right.
So they've also invested tremendously in their own domestic industry and also overseas tying other countries and key materials through the Belt and Road Initiative. So that's kind of also kind of known and trending good for them. That third term is where there's huge question marks, the political control. And as you get closer to Go Day, which could be in January, to be able to tell Xi Jinping, yes, we are high confidence that you would prevail. These three terms are well known. The biggest question mark for a PLA, Chinese military planner, is in that political control. So what do? You test with a bayonet. You poke and you probe, you try to see. And quite frankly, this is serious business, which means bloodshed is accepted. And the Chinese have a strategic culture that embraces this. And so we should not be surprised if there's more of these events. But what it tells me is the equation is a good way to, in a general sense, to kind of look at these world events and also assess that we are trending in a bad direction. Again, the jury is out if the administration and Congress's efforts to put more money and resources in the budget will move that military balance in a real way in the next 15 months. It's also interesting to see economic. Will the tariffs, will the economic inshoring investment, like we've seen with South Korean shipbuilders in the United States, and there are others, will it actually have a great coming together to mitigate the Chinese ability to wage economic warfare against the collective West? And then finally, I think there's a lot of space where we can operate differently to really cause concern in Beijing or uncertainty and make that question mark in that third term of political control bigger, not smaller.
Hey, excellent response to that question on the equation. And a couple of interesting things that you mentioned. One, the bayonet analogy. I mean, that's so apropos out in the Pacific where the Chinese have been probing. And you hear a lot about the bayonet with regard to Putin, Russia, Ukraine.
Yes.
So you push in the steel bayonet, and if you feel mush, you continue to push until you hit steel, and then you withdraw. So it's very important that that military balance you talk about in the equation be strong on our side, so that there is that impact against steel that will deter the adversary, whether it be the Russians or whether it be the Chinese, from continuing their aggression. And the other thing you mentioned, which is interesting, is on the military balance, a lot of things go into that, ship count, et cetera, VLS tubes. And we have seen some decommissionings recently, which has dropped our inventory of VLS tubes. And there are some members of Congress who've been highlighting this and are upset about it. We have a plan to catch up with the Virginia payload module to take the place of the SSGNs, which have been just phenomenal platforms. I mean, I had Florida and Odyssey Dawn shot over 100 missiles, and you saw most recently strike against Isfahan was from an SSGN. So great success for the submarine force, but they've got to be replaced. So how concerned are you about an imbalance in the number of tubes at sea?
Again, we can't, from a perspective of our operational concepts and thinking about what that means, like, the risk is mitigate. We can mitigate that. But the Chinese look at it very differently. They see the downward trends not being reversed, which means that the United States is unserious about its security commitments overseas. That's how I would interpret it if I was role-playing a Chinese in Beijing and from my experience with them over the decades. So we're giving them a signals like red meat in front of them that now's the time. We're reducing our military size as they are reaching peak readiness. So it does matter. It doesn't matter as much from like our ability to wage an effective military campaign, but if the goal is deterrence, we're not doing the right thing, and we need to. This is where maybe unmanned conversation comes in. It comes back to on that military equation. How can you get more firepower to field or to sea quicker? Marines deployed over the summer in Bala-Katan with Nemesis missiles to the boundaries. Missiles are not that great a range. Not going to be able to close the Luzon Straits with one unit and a couple of these missiles. But now you've given the Chinese more things to worry about. That's firepower in theater. Putting maybe more missiles on the back of like the USV, the Ranger that we saw in 2021 that launched an SM-6. Yeah, it's by themselves, it's not going to win the war, but you've just complicated the Chinese mill-to-mill calculation. That's the goal. It's deterrence. And we got to, again, go back to, we have to be careful not to mirror the way the Chinese are doing things as to how we have to do things. We have to fight our own war, and that means focusing on their weaknesses. And in their risk calculation of that equation. There's a lot of weaknesses and vulnerabilities. We just have to take them serious and act on them.
Let me drill down on the unmanned piece because you and I have talked about this before. First of all, on the military balance part of the equation, the United States has come forward, or the United States Navy has come forward with 30-year shipbuilding plans and nav plans that talk, from 2016 forward, and 355 ships most recently. Nav plan 2024, 381 ships, plus a curious number of 134 unmanned platforms for a total battle force of 515 ships, which is kind of a nice number, if you think about it. It's not 600 of the John Layman era. It's not all fully crewed or manned ships. It's maybe a 20% of the fleet are unmanned. And, I hesitate to say it because the term, has some detractors, but is this another revolution in military affairs in the unmanned realm? I mean, are we moving in a direction where, like Ukraine, we could change the entire face of the battlefield? I mean, look what they've done. They've put 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea fleet on the bottom of the Black Sea and pushed the Russians out of Sevastopol to Novorossiysk on the other side of the Black Sea. I know that geography well, and so do you. So is that what we're getting after here? Is that where you think we're going with this 134 unmanned platforms? Or is this something that John Layman said in his forward? Is this looking at their strategy and, as you just pointed out, optimizing on their vulnerabilities? What do you think?
Well, I hope so. I think the jury is still out. I'm hopeful in the current budget that there'll be we'll put our chips down make a few bets. And I think the best bet is getting those medium to larger unmanned vessels armed with air and missile defense, maybe even some strike capability like TLAM. And the idea is to have that disaggregate targets for the Chinese to have to worry about. It also allows to free up some of the bigger manned vessels to go do other more lethal missions, like the Arleigh Burkes. From having to be a missile defense asset around Guam, they can be much more forward, killing more Chinese. But in this case, I would not say any of this is revolutionary.
Yeah.
It's an augment. And again, robotics, going back to my work initially with the system engineering, was in robotics and nonlinear control systems. That was called, now we know them as AI, artificial intelligence and algorithms. And the idea is that these are actually tools that augment. And so while you may have one man vessel driving around Guam, you might have a flotilla of like 6 or 7 of these unmanned vessels armed to the teeth, relatively speaking, because you're talking about a vessel, maybe 100, 200 ton size vessel, but has a few of these weapons. You have, in essence, perhaps a 3-ship flotilla of destroyers in effect with firepower at sea. But you only have one manned vessel, and you've just disaggregated from 3 very strategically valuable manned warships. Now you've got easy to build and to replace, but also a lot harder to target by the Chinese. This I wouldn't say is a revolution. I would say the revolution was the first one, or the last one, in the late 90s, early 2000s. It's just now the technologies are being seen in real time in the battlefield in Ukraine and the Black Sea.
You are listening to Maritime Nation, the Center for Maritime Strategies podcast designed to dive deeply into the policy challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States as a sea power on the global stage. We aim to provide you with the highest quality analysis on the most pressing maritime security challenges by joining in conversation with key experts and practitioners. This season is produced with support from Dataminr. Dataminr is recognized as one of the world's leading AI businesses. The company's clients are the first to know about high-impact events and emerging risks so they can mitigate and manage crises more effectively. Dataminr solutions are relied on 24/7 by hundreds of clients, including the Department of Defense, in over 100 countries across 6 continents to help them solve real-world problems. Here at CMS, our whole team uses Dataminr's First Alert to stay up to date on breaking news or crises that impact our national security or the security of our allies and partners. And you mentioned, getting the SM-6 out on an unmanned platform, the Ranger. We did that in 2021. It's been a 4-year hiatus now. We're in the final stages of fielding a hypersonic missile. We've been working on it through the Strategic Programs Office and Admiral Wolf for quite a while. We annually conduct, and I think you're familiar with the Congressional Maritime Intensive Trainer for professional staffers from the House and Senate on the Hill. We just had 22 staffers in here a few weeks ago. And one of the most popular ad hoc faculty members is Captain Jim Fitzsimons of the Halsey Alpha Group from the Naval War College. I mean, he is just fantastic. So it's an unclassed presentation. He's given it for the past 3 years. And it's all about, along the lines of what Secretary Lehman said in the foreword. Hey, I'm not so, Captain Fitzsimons, I'm not so hung up on China and 400 ships as I am about their capability to conduct long-range precision strike and our inability to match that. So the Chinese have the DF-17 hypersonic, the DF-21, the DF-26. Essentially, they have created what is known in the vernacular as a weapons exclusion zone out to the second island chain. Now, Admiral Paparo has talked about this in his public statements. We are not to be deterred by that. There are ways that we can maneuver in that space, but yet we don't have a match for long-range precision strike. Are you concerned or overly concerned about that in the response to the Chinese aggression equation on military balance?
It is something that has to be considered. It took us far too long to walk away from the INF treaty, which really held us back from getting those systems.
Exactly.
Even though the Russians were known to have been violating things. Thankfully, now a lot of this is out in the open. We can talk about more freely. But we wasted too much time on that. Army was too resistant from embracing this air and missile defense. It was like a third rail for them while they were fighting wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But even as we were rebalancing the last decade to the Asia Pacific, there was resistance to it. It's not what infantry men and women want to do.
Yeah.
That's changed. Now we're in a production race. I mean, we've got hypersonics, Army's deploying, like Typhoon system has been deployed, at least the launcher system, to the Philippines in deployments. Now's the time to actually start refining it and start producing at scale. We've been waiting too long. It will, like I said, the goal is you need to get more firepower downrange.
Right.
And this is one way. At the same time, the Marines are also putting their bets on this and developing their capabilities. The Navy has to do so as well. The Air Force is another interesting conversation. But, air-launched long-range cruise missiles come to mind, maybe even air-launched ballistic missiles. We know those can work. They are working in our adversaries' arsenals as well.
Excellent. Yeah, I hadn't thought about air-launched ballistic missiles. I know Alcoms are pretty important to the inventory and have had great success over campaigns in the last 20 years. Let's pivot to the second section of the book, which discusses China's growing economic leverage, particularly over global supply chains. How can a revolution in shipping revitalize America's commercial maritime base and weaken Chinese leverage? What role would new technologies and concepts such as small modular reactors and seamless multi-mode transport, you've written a lot about this.
Yes.
You wrote about it in Returning from Ebb Tide. What role would that play in this revolution?
Yeah, so the important thing is this all comes back to trying to fill a strategic vulnerability, and that's in our industrial or our trade or our shipping, and also our naval shipbuilding. And what I realized even before I left the Navy is the only way we're going to fix naval shipbuilding, because there's a capacity issue, is that we have to fix our civil shipping and shipbuilding sectors, because you can't continue to just have a taxpayer funded naval shipbuilding program. It hasn't worked. So we have to take a much more sector-wide approach. The other thing is for that to be politically viable, sustainable, and it has to be economically sustainable. And so you have to look at what is going to be America's comparative advantage in the global maritime marketplace. And this is a change. This is not, the Jones Act has an important role to play. This doesn't touch that, and make very clear about this. This is a focus in on how do we develop a comparative American advantage. And right now, we're going to have to rely on certain capabilities and competencies, but most importantly, capacity of our treaty allies like the South Koreans and the Japanese, and others to really kind of deliver on it. But you have to have a direction. I mean, it's one thing to think about what your comparative advantage is and try and mirror, again, that cardinal sin that I mentioned earlier is mirror your rival. In this case, it's the Chinese Communist Party and their shipping sector and shipbuilding sector. We have to figure out how are we going to do a paradigm shift and get ahead of them or change the whole dynamic of shipping. And this is the revolution in shipping's idea. And it's like a cocktail of technologies, some of which aren't even in the maritime industry or in sector today, but could impact it. Drones, heavy lift dirigibles, which may seem a little bit out there, but we did it in the lead up and even during World War II, but using them for cargo, not for ecotourism, for example. Big data analytics for very smart, very fluid movement, connecting distributed manufacturing, 3D kind of printing, but manufacturing that's much more distributed in real time with a very amorphous and evolving logistics plan. And at the top of this is the small modular nuclear reactors, another part of the cocktail, but a key element. You can produce ships, and it's going to change the business model because all the cost of the fuel and the operation, the business is front loaded. But you have a ship now that most of the operating costs, other than the crew, are already included. You also can fast steam, so you need less ships for the same throughput on a shipping route. If you want to grow it, you can add another ship. But that one ship has more value because it can steam at a faster speed without environmental limitations or cost of fuel issues. So fewer ships, cleaner ships, able to move quicker, more responsive, all together with the dirigibles, big data analytics, smart ports. You have all of the makings of an American revolution in shipping. The third one, because containerization in cargo shipping as well as modular manufacturing are American inventions. Why not this? Yeah.
Hey, I'm with you. First of all, just listening to you, I'm inspired. It's like a John F. Kennedy moonshot discussion. And you have challenged industry and America to come up with solutions for some of these challenges, some of which exist. So I'm with you on small modular reactors. I mean, the Center for Maritime Strategy fully supports that concept. We got a whole chapter in the book by our friends from Core Power on that. And, as these things become safer, liquid molten salt reactors, something Rickover experimented with and prototype back then, didn't quite tweak the technology to be viable for a submarine. But today, I think it's safe and perfectly capable of being put on a merchant ship or a merchant marine ship. And it gives you kind of an unlimited power with an electric drive system, like you said, reduces, burning fossil fuel, reduces carbon footprint, becomes more efficient, more clean. I'm all for it. You, in your book and in the book you participated in with us, talk about the transition from intermodalism, the container, the box, to multimodalism. You got some great ideas there, and some of them are, kind of futuristic. Like, could we not have to rely on the port of Los Angeles, a single port for all of our shipping coming into the West Coast of the United States? Could we park ships offshore and lift containers from those ships with unmanned systems, dirigibles, or zeppelins? First of all, can we lift something that heavy, or would you expect that to be a breakthrough in the next few years? And then where do you put it if not in the port? I guess you would fly it into the state and far away from the shore so that there could be a distribution center like some of the big box furniture Costco, Walmart have to deliver those goods across the rails and the highways of America. Is that the way you envision it working?
So to put the money to it, there is a need for proof of concept to actually refine the business model, but the business model is pretty solid. And the technologies are not science fictional. Even the small modular reactors, these are proven concepts. It's not science fiction. It's bringing all of these concepts and techniques and technologies together is what's unique. But a little bit on the cost side. So let's take Los Angeles, for example, and keep focused on that. So one of three main ports of entry for large container ships. Those are the economies of scale that make business sense today, but they have huge deep draft requirements. They have special cranes that you need to have. Then you have to have laydown space. Then you have to have the ability to bring in lots of trucks because you're moving tens of thousands of these containers on the highways or to get them to a rail hub. And then that means you're probably also going to have refrigeration, storage, and warehouses.
Yeah, exactly.
And dredging and building out that ports that aren't ready for that. You're talking the order of several $billions. Then if you're going to add in railheads, you're going to expand highways, you're also talking in the order of billions of dollars. Better would be to disaggregate that and find ways to try to diversify at a much less cost. So where you can have the same economy of scale in the big ship with the containers, nuclear powered, operating off the coast, mostly, not all the time. They still will come in and do transfers, perhaps still going to Los Angeles, but as it's built and as it's constructed, and probably with just as much throughput for the longshoremen there, but there'll be more job opportunities for the longshoremen and for truckers and for perhaps drone operators, dirigible operators, as these ships move along the coastline and they're being met by feeder vessels that come in and go into smaller ports that maybe only have a draft of 30 feet and have older cranes or smaller cranes that can move just a few of these TEU, these containers off of.
Yeah.
And then perhaps as you're moving up there, more time-sensitive medical type, more environmentally controlled, but in smaller containers or containers that are broken down at sea. This is, taking a page out of Amazon's expeditionary warehousing, but doing it on a ship at sea. As you're moving along the coast, perhaps having a dirigible that meets, and they do have the capacity to pick up a TEU. There are working prototypes that can do this. And the idea is that you then would meet at sea, you pick it up and you move it in 500 miles to the warehouse or to the distribution center.
Wow.
So you can avoid delays and warehousing cost.
Very efficient.
So the idea is to try to get the efficiencies. But again, the thinking, the logic is there. We need to do a proof of concept to refine the business model, but convinced that this is a very real possibility, and it's going to enable the disaggregated, distributed manufacturing that we're starting to see.
That's fantastic. And I'm glad to hear you say there's really no conflict with labor or stevedores or people doing the work in the cranes on the pier, because there's plenty of business for LA, and sometimes they get logjammed with ships that are waiting to be serviced offshore. So this would give us an opportunity to bring more goods and services into the U.S. So yes. Fantastic. Well, you also argue that America needs a modern naval act akin to the Naval Act of 1938. And if Congress passed a 21st Century Naval Act, which programs, policies, and funding lines must be included, how would this differ from previous congressional action to bolster maritime shipbuilding?
Yeah, so simple is the solution on this, both for the political realities that we're in, but also for executing and keeping the resources going to the desired end state, which is why I'm very much against a naval act being subsumed inside the National Defense Authorization Acts, the NDA. Thousands of pages that's got Army, Marine Corps, it's got Space Force, everything's in there in the kitchen sink that's in the Pentagon. Some things that shouldn't be that are really more in other departments like NIH. So I think it needs to stand alone, for one, so that because it's built for purpose, and that the idea is that you get a large enough order for ships. You get the savings of economy of scale. Again, proven in real time, and historical record bears this out, 5 to 15% savings when you buy naval vessels in larger block buys, proven. The other thing is that you can also take that to a massive scale by larger numbers, but again, it has to be stable design ships. And the numbers that I've proposed have always been in the numbers and the class of ships that are already in the 5-year plan, the FIDUP, the Future Years Planning document. So, back to simple. If you have a standalone budget and you have a, say, $153 billion bill and it's appropriated, the detail about how you actually manage it, there needs to be new accounting tools in that, of course, to hold the shipbuilders and the Navy to account. We did that also in the 30s and through the 40s and World War II for underperforming yards. But when you have it as a bill for ships and you have things like SAWS, which is a contracting mechanism to allow that you could use that first payment for ships. Say, for example, the 5th or the 6th ship in the plan, you front load that investment so you can grow your workforce. So what you do is you move all of that money that you've been given and you make your capital investments. The way we do things now is that you money only for per ship that you've ordered. Right. And that has not allowed or enabled the shipbuilders to make the capital investments needed. And there's a third piece to this, which I'm arguing to make sure it's included in the Ships for America Act, another very important piece of legislation. And that is we looked at distributed profit taxation. And the Estonians perfected this. And what they did is they said, all right, company A, if you invest back in workforce or into infrastructure, that's tax-free. The other part of your profits that you don't do that, we're going to tax, to include like stock buybacks. So why not apply an American version of this to American shipbuilding, where you say, okay, American shipbuilder A, you made $10 billion in profit. That's probably excessive, but let's just say for mathematical reasons, you made $10 billion in profits, and you put $5 billion of that into port expansion and modernization, and you put another $3 billion into a whole bunch of efforts to grow your workforce, new hiring, better pay. So $8 billion of that's tax-free. The other $2 billion you're going to put into stock buybacks. You might actually do like bonus payments. That's taxable by the federal government. So the idea is to incentivize on ledger basis that makes better business sense to make long-term strategic investments. And it worked in Estonia. It can work here at an American characteristics.
Yeah, thanks for the expanded narrative on that. So if not in the NDAA, we're talking about a lot of money here.
Yes.
Is it Department of Transportation that administers this? Does it devolve to MARAD? Do we need a maritime shipbuilding czar to administer this? Thoughts on that?
We definitely need a maritime czar. In the legislation, and I've argued also, because shipbuilding is in between or includes both national security and national economic concerns. So inside the White House, you got the NEC for economic and you have the National Security Council for security. This is actually both. So you need someone in the White House that sits between both of those. And it's in the legislation. I think there's a need for it more than ever to make sure that you keep those two things together. For all the reasons I mentioned before, it's not sustainable if it doesn't make good economic sense. It's also not sustainable if it can't produce warships on time. So yes, you definitely need a maritime czar. As far as who executes this, if it's Navy ships, it's going to be the Navy.
Right.
But it has to be, I think, a separate appropriations.
Okay.
Yep.
That'll be challenging, but it's a great idea. Now, that kind of is a great segue into the next question. The final section of the book recommends a reorganization of multiple government agencies and departments. So let's talk about two of these. First of all, your call for creation of a Maritime Department. Mm-hmm. What existing government institution would be folded into that new department?
Yeah. So right now, principally the Navy stays in Department of Defense because its mission is, at the end of the day, it's about being ready to wage war.
Yeah.
Not to wage economic industrial policies or peacetime maritime policing. That's the Coast Guard's mission. But when you look around this town and you look at all of the main players that are involved in the maritime industrial revitalization of the nation, Navy, of course, has a role. But first and foremost, you got Maritime Administration over in Department of Transportation. You've got, of course, the U.S. Coast Guard that's in regulatory, but also certification and also maritime policing in our waters. So that's the DHS. They're over in DHS. They're a tiny player in the DHS. MARAD, by the way, is teeny tiny in transportation.
Yeah.
Then you've got NOAA.
Too small, right?
Way too small.
Should be much bigger. Much
bigger. If you use the same metrics for aviation and rail and highway, by volume of commerce that are on those means, we should have probably about 4 times size, maybe 5 times bigger. So you're talking of going from they're actually 200 under where they're supposed to be at 900, about 700 people. They should have 900. So you're looking at probably about a 5,000 person staff that you need to be where you would want to. Getting there is a different story. But again, you can also get there by being better organized, quicker. Yeah. And that's the Maritime Department. So NOAA could be your intelligence arm for making sure that our seabed and our sea life, like our fisheries, are being protected, but anticipating where they are and also what their value is. And then finally, outside, and NOAA's inside commerce, and they kind of are so large they can kind of do their own thing. So the discipline would be getting them into a maritime-focused department. The final one is the Federal Maritime Commission. And it's been interesting. It's been eye-watering to watch the last year. They become much more aggressive overseas and bad behavior, and looking at it and trying to hold to account unfair trade practices and industrial policies and regulations that disadvantage the American consumer.
Can you give me some examples of
that? So right now there's a study out looking at choke points. And what they're trying to do is look at trying to quantify the impact that Chinese influence in controlled ports is having on provision of services, delay of time at pier, delay of handling cargo, perhaps even excessive costs. This we saw during the COVID recovery, where container prices, there was gouging that was going on. It started to happen again not too long ago with the Houthis. But to look at where this market manipulation's been happening. Now, that study was called for back in February of this year. Haven't seen the results. So that's a choke. They call it a choke points review. There's a 301 complaint. So another real one is this. This started back in the last year of the Biden administration. It was finalized in January, and it's been used as a rationale for some of the tariffs against the Chinese now in the shipping. And it was a complaint about unfair trade practices in Chinese steel manufacturing, dumping on the market, which makes it impossible to sustain domestic steel production, a key element of shipbuilding here in the United States. The other is also their shipping practices as state-controlled entities like Costco.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese are giant in control of overseas ports and crane operations. I mean, Sri Lanka and Hambantota come to mind. They forgave a lot of their debt, about a third of their debt, but the Chinese control that major port. And sooner or later, the gates of that port are going to go shut to people that the Chinese don't want to come in. I think of, Piraeus in Greece, in Athens, that is progressively seeing more Chinese foreign direct investment into that port, and I can only imagine how much control they have over shipping cranes and pier space. And then now we're starting to see some encroachments in the Marshalls and the Solomon Islands too.
Yes.
That's our own fault. I mean, we kind of screwed that up in not establishing a relationship in the last decade with those very important islands out in the Pacific. Well, the second recommendation that you make calls for significant changes in the U.S. Navy's fleet structure.
Yes.
So, why does the current structure need reform, and what would it mean to have, in your terms, quote, an oceans-informed force allocation instead of a joint geographic command? And how does that inform force allocation?
Yeah, so the first thing is the geographic commands. They're geographic and they're terrestrial in nature. They're based on land views. The lines that go out into the ocean are really just extensions of land borders. The Indian Ocean is a great example, and another one was Israel was not part of CENTCOM for political reasons, and now it is because the geography is one kind of outlier. But if you look at the Indian Ocean today, you've got 3 geographic commanders that are responsible for the Indian Ocean. But the Indian Ocean is a maritime system that's connected by history, by trade, and by common culture and language in many cases. So we're drawing these lines that are completely ignorant of the realities of in the ground and on the seas. And so the idea is you allow the COCOMs to exist as they always have, focused on the land side. But the oceans, you look at a naval approach. So you wouldn't have 3 different authorities managing the naval and the maritime in the Indian Ocean. You'd have 1. And that's not to say that you'd have a new COCOM for the Indian Ocean. That's not what I'm saying on this one. But you would have a numbered fleet that would represent that entire area, and the component commanders.
Oh, this is the first fleet.
I'm working. I love the first fleet, but the idea is
that's a very controversial proposal.
Yeah, I think its time has come. There were some interesting indications in the last year, in the last administration, that things were moving, and I'm very optimistic still in recent trips downrange this year, and even just last month, that the time has come, and there's a way to get to it. I spend a lot of time in Asia, so I'll come to that, But the idea is let the fleets, and this is again, the focus is ship to the number of fleets. Focus on the numbered fleets and let the naval component commanders, the very senior admirals that are the bridge between the geographic combatant commanders and the components, actually worked with the numbered fleets instead. So it doesn't change much, but it changes a lot. If you follow my meaning with actual structures and personnel. First Fleets is a new creation. So this is the only add. And it's not like we're going to add like a replica of 7th Fleet, 50 to 70 ships overnight. That's not what's going to happen. But today, there are EPF, these expeditionary fast vessels that are rotationally deployed with merchant mariners crewing them that rotate through Singapore and Sembawang. You've got potential submarines based in HMS Sterling in Western Australia, also coming in 2027. So we're going to have more naval presence in the region. But we also have destroyer squadron in Changi and Singapore as well. And we have destroyers that from 7th Fleet that are dispatched down to that squadron and operate in the South. So the idea is to provide a 3-star admiral structured, very well-known numbered fleet structure with 2 missions primarily. One, wage a maritime counterinsurgency against the Chinese, focused in on the South China Sea. Doesn't require aircraft carriers all the time. It doesn't require a dedicated fleet, but it does start with a new flagship or command ship on one of these EPFs. 7th Fleet did this in 2018 under Admiral Sawyer by necessity because the Blue Ridge is in maintenance. Do it again. And you would rotate around with a ship that's already very familiar. You wouldn't bring a new vessel in. It would still rotate. And you'd have a small flag staff and operational staff focused on the region, maybe the 3 or 4 folks, officers at 7th Fleet. They get relocated down to Singapore, and they're now on the flagship. But the flagship can move around like they have the EPFs. But the secondary mission is being on scene and accelerating and making sure any roadblocks or unforeseen circumstances that might delay the development of the milestones for AUKUS are addressed. So perhaps this could be a submarine officer, a nuke officer that's running it, but it doesn't have to be. But the number one is wage a maritime counterinsurgency, start to show folks that we are present. There's an appetite, a hunger in many of these countries that are in dispute with China: Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam. That may not be uniform, all the same, but they are all trending very much into wanting to see more American presence. And the story I always go back to on this is look at the success by luck of the West Kapala incident in 2020. That was a case study of what naval statecraft looks like in action.
Fantastic ideas. Very intriguing set of proposals there. And just to comment on a couple of things you said, we talk about joint geographic commands. I agree with you. The UCP is based a lot on the land. We came to that determination in the writing of CS21R, the revision to the cooperative strategy for the 21st century. And I was part of that. When Admiral Greenert wanted a wake-up call, said, hey, why do we call it the Asia Pacific when that's apples and oranges? Asia's a continent, Pacific's an ocean. It's about the Indian Ocean and the Pacific and the intersection of the two. So it became the Indo-Pacific, and we changed the name. And I'm glad we did that. As far as giving more responsibility, more authority, more accountability to naval officers, we're both naval officers, so I'm all about that. Yep. I think it's great. Before Secretary Rumsfeld, we used to call Land Fleet or Fleet Forces SINC Land Fleet, Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet, SINCUS NAVUR, Commander-in-Chief U.S. Naval Forces Europe and Africa. And I think, the members of the Joint Force that know the most about the maritime are obviously the fleet commanders, and that's why we have numbered fleets. So we need to start pushing that responsibility or delegating that responsibility down. So I think great ideas there, and I would love to see some traction on that in the future. Well, Brent, this has been great. We're out of time, folks. That's a wrap. I'd like to thank Brent Sadler for joining Maritime Nation, and I would like to thank our listeners for joining us each month. And if you have not heard our previous episodes, you can always catch up on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Episodes and all content described here today can be found on our new website, www.centerformaritimestrategy.org, all lowercase. Thanks to James Peterson, our sound engineer, and Dataminr for their sponsorship and support of Maritime Nation. Stay tuned for the next episode. See you next time.